like to begin by exploring a pressing concern in the country. Do you believe Sri Lanka's democracy is fundamentally flawed?
I would be hesitant to say that Sri Lanka's democracy is fundamentally flawed. Problems that we need to resolve very quickly. But largely speaking, I think we have to reinforce our commitment to democracy, and any ideology or discourse that calls for an alternative to democracy needs to be resisted. So devolution of power, I think, is something that we have failed to do, despite the fact that there is a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which requires substantial devolution. We have not done that. We have to understand that when you introduce an amendment to the Constitution, the Constitution remains the new document, the document that is as amended. So there's no question of implementing or not implementing the 13th Amendment. It is implementing or not implementing the Constitution. This is the time for a renewed commitment to liberal democratic values. Democracy and human rights going hand in hand. A move away from the centralization of power, both in terms of the executive presidency and in terms of devolving power is very important. So I think we need to think about all of these models and options and look at strengthening democracy as opposed to rejecting it.
From examining citizen trust and participation to exploring avenues for systematic improvement, our dialogue has shed light on critical issues facing Sri Lanka today. We've had an insightful dialogue with Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, a partner at LexAG Legal Consultants and the Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Stay tuned.
Some bonds give more returns. Get more security and more interest on your fixed deposits from Sri Lanka's largest finance company, LMDtv Finance.
Hello and welcome to LMDtv. Today we explore a profound topic. Is democracy a panacea? Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, an eminent lawyer specializing in corporate, constitutional and international law and a partner at LexAG Legal Consultants. Dr. Gunatilleke also serves as a Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Dr. Gunatilleke, thank you for being a part of our show tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'd like to begin by exploring a pressing concern in the country. Given the pervasive issues of corruption and inefficiency, do you believe Sri Lanka's democracy is fundamentally flawed?
I would be hesitant to say that Sri Lanka's democracy is fundamentally flawed. I think there are some fundamental problems in our democracy and problems that we need to resolve very quickly because there is a crisis of democracy in Sri Lanka. But it would be dangerous, and I think we should think twice before questioning democracy in Sri Lanka wholesale. I think democracy is not a perfect system. I recall, I think it was Churchill who said that democracy isn't the perfect system, but it's the best system we have, right? So we have to work with it. And the position that democracy is fundamentally flawed in Sri Lanka could lead to claims that there are alternatives to democracy that ought to be explored. And I think that's a dangerous path to go down. So we are stuck with a system that isn't perfect, but we are all committed to that system. And at least from an electoral democratic point of view, there are many facets to democracy, of course. But if you think of elections, Sri Lanka, unlike a lot of its neighbors, has largely remained committed to elections and electing officials. There have been many occasions in which elections are not free and fair. But largely speaking, I think we have to reinforce our commitment to democracy, and any ideology or discourse that calls for an alternative to democracy needs to be resisted.
And what radical changes or innovations do you think are necessary to transform the system into one that genuinely serves people's interests and addresses deep-seated systematic issues?
Yeah, I think the most radical change from what we have at the moment has to be a move away from centralizing power. In a system, and you rightly pointed out in your first question, a system that has absorbed a lot of corruption, a lot of inefficiency, the centralization of power can be extremely damaging. And I'd like to make 2 points here. One is you need to move away from centralizing governmental power within the central element of government, parliament. And you need to start devolving power to various levels of government, where the exercise of power is actually done in a manner that is close to the people. So strengthening the other tiers of government, the local government tier, the provincial council tier, in addition to ensuring that our national sort of central governmental structure is also rid of corruption, is really important. So devolution of power, I think, is something that we have failed to do, despite the fact that there is an amendment to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which requires substantial devolution. We have not done that. And I think we need to also move away from this idea that it is an optional thing. Many governments, even opposition parties, come and say, we are going to either not implement the 13th Amendment, or we're going to implement the 13th Amendment in full, or even some parties will say we will go beyond the 13th Amendment, right? We have to understand that when you introduce an amendment to the Constitution remains the new document, the document that is as amended. So there's no question of implementing or not implementing the 13th Amendment. It is implementing or not implementing the Constitution. And our Constitution has been amended many times, and one of those amendments is the 13th Amendment. And it's not an option to implement the provincial council system. So I think devolution of power is very important. The second point is also the concentration of power in one individual, and that is the executive president. And we have seen how damaging that can be if that individual happens to take bad decisions, right? Everything flows from the overarching power of the executive presidency. And if there are mistakes made, if there are points at which we should have had more deliberative discussion, as opposed to one person making decisions, we might be able to avoid the crises that we have encountered in the recent past. So abolishing the executive presidency as it stands now and substantially reducing the powers of the president to certain specific powers. You can have the president as the head of the armed forces, you can have the president exercising certain ceremonial powers, but essentially not looking at the president as the person that all power flows from is really important. So just to wrap up that point, I think radical change needs to be a move away from the centralization of power. And we need to do that in terms of the tiers of government on the one hand, and also moving away from the executive presidency on the other.
We cannot deny that the phrase best of the bad lot often surfaces during elections, reflecting how many citizens feel about their voting choices. Doctor, what are your insights on this sentiment, and what steps can be taken to enhance trust in the democratic process?
So I think one of the important things to look at is political culture. And political culture can't be transformed in a few years. It often takes a generation to transform. And you're absolutely right in terms of pointing to the deep lack of trust citizens have in the political establishment. And that has a lot to do with our political culture, a culture that has embraced nepotism, a culture that has embraced corruption, and a culture that has embraced violence. So we need to really question our political culture and explore how we can transform this culture. And there are some positive examples as well from Sri Lanka that you can point to. For example, if you look back at the early 2000s and throughout our post-independence history, you would see a lot of violence taking place in the lead up to elections and just after elections. Political violence and inter-party violence was commonplace. It was just part and parcel of an election. And you had that all the way up to the early 2000s. Something changed. Something very interesting happened in Sri Lanka. where, having that level of election violence has actually ended. You don't have parties, winning elections and then burning the houses of the other party. You don't have a lot of violence the way we did have violence in the 90s and early 2000s in the lead up to an election. And that political culture actually changed. And there might be many reasons for that, maybe perhaps something to really explore and understand. One of those reasons is that people have better ways of recording and documenting that violence. There are a lot of civil society organizations that focus on election violence. And I think there's been some contribution to that change of political culture as a result. Today, we do have elections that sometimes can be questioned in terms of how free and fair they are, but we don't have the same level of violence. And I think that's not to say that Sri Lanka's democracy is not violent at all. There's so much violence that does take place. But that's a good example of how political culture can change over a generation. So if we were to place our trust in political actors that we have some faith in terms of their commitments to anti-corruption, commitments to efficiency, commitments against nepotism, give them a chance, there might be a possibility that political culture very incrementally changes over time. So it's not a hopeless situation, but I can certainly sympathize with the view that this is a distressing situation, and trust indeed has been broken quite fundamentally. And that is why we saw so many people coming out on the streets and questioning the legitimacy of our leaders.
Voter apathy is a significant issue in Sri Lanka. What factors contribute to this, and how can we encourage more active political participation?
I think it is wrong to say that Sri Lanka has massive voter apathy when it comes to elections, right? So you're absolutely right that people are very apathetic between elections. But when it comes to an election, our turnout rates are quite high. And I think people do still value elections, and people do turn up for elections in a manner that is not comparable in other parts of the world. So I don't think we have totally apathetic voters. But there's definitely a problem, and I think your question can also lead to this conclusion, that we have a problem in terms of indifference as far as holding our politicians to account in terms of their electoral promises, their manifestos, right? So you have a manifesto, everyone knows, oh, this is what they say at an election. Then you vote for whoever you prefer, and then we forget about the manifestos, and we don't really hold our political leaders to account for the promises they make at an election. So in between an election, we certainly have a serious problem of indifference. Maybe that is changing. I think the struggle that we saw over the last couple of years, which we would term the Aral, saw a lot of activism and civic consciousness that might challenge that notion that voters are apathetic. But it did come to a point where the economic situation in the country was so dire that people had no choice but to protest. I wonder whether that would have been the case had it just been a question of corruption or governance alone and not economic. So I think there is a serious problem in terms of voter indifference, but that problem really arises in between elections as opposed to at the election itself.
Shifting gears to a topic that you just brought forth, Aral. There have been claims that the Aral movement was subverted by violent elements. How significant was this infiltration in your opinion, and how did it affect the movement's legitimacy and objectives?
I mean, that's a great question, and unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that. I think it's important not to treat the Aral as one homogeneous movement. I think it was a very organic movement with some organized elements, and it kind of evolved into something rather than was, planned in a very meticulous way. And it didn't have a central leadership. I mean, if you compare the Aral with, say, the Satyagraha movement that Gandhi championed, there was a very visible leadership. And what Gandhi said or what Gandhi recommended was often followed. Of course, there were other leaders that contested him, and there was always deliberation. But essentially, there was a very visible leadership. In Aral, I don't think that visible leadership, although there were prominent actors, that came forward and took some leadership role and spoke for people who were participating in Arugale, it certainly didn't emerge that way and was much more organic. There's something wonderful about organic movements. So this is not a criticism of Arugale, but I think it's important to describe Arugale as much more organic movement than an organized movement. So when you have an organic movement like that, you do have the risk of various political elements, including violent elements, infiltrating. And I think it would be very naive to say that there were no violent elements that infiltrated. Right? You had a mix of various actors, good faith actors, you had civil society activists, you had ordinary people that would have never come on the streets that actually participated. And you had political elements that were also trying to opportunistically use the movement, right? And I think it was the culmination of all these factors that made Arugale what it was. So I would be very hesitant to criticize Arugale as something that was infiltrated by violent movements. I think that's an overstatement, and that's often used by political actors to delegitimize the Arugale. But I also would be hesitant to whitewash it, saying that no, there were no violent elements. There were violent elements, and that is a fact. But I think that is the nature of the Arugale. That is because we didn't have this planned kind of organized movement. It was much more organic. And because it was organic, it was very difficult to also suppress. And its success in many ways, depending on how you measure success, of course, was down to the fact that no government actor could really suppress it by just taking out some leaders, right? Just by arresting certain leaders, you couldn't suppress Arugale because it was so organic, because it was leaderless in many ways. So that I think is important to understand when it comes to Arugale.
Further on the Arugale, I would like to talk about how critics argue that the movement was too much focused on the removal of specific individuals rather than a systematic change. In your view, was this a strategic mistake? What broad structural changes should have been prioritized to ensure sustainable and meaningful democratic reform in Sri Lanka?
See, again, it all depends on what you view or how you actually frame the Arugale. Was it an organized, planned movement with a particular strategy, or was it a really much more organic mix of various actors coming together? And I think it was the latter. And the removal of the former president, or calling for his resignation, was the one unifying factor, right? So I think if we were to say this is a strategy, which I don't think it was. I don't think it was a particular set of actors saying, oh, this is the strategy we will run and we will try and move the people towards this strategy. I don't think that was quite what happened. It was much more organic, and people rallied around a particular slogan, right? I think if you look at it that way, that slogan was very important for bringing various actors with different political backgrounds, different agendas, different priorities coming together to call for one thing, and that's the resignation of the president. So in that sense, it was indeed something that happened and something that led to, in some sense, a success, right? So if you think of Arugale's main objective as calling for the resignation of one individual, it was successful. It did ultimately lead to that person's resignation. Whether we agree with how it happened or not is a different matter, right? So that in that sense, the strategy of focusing on individuals, and it was not just the president, the finance minister had to step down, the prime minister stepped down, the central bank governor had to step down. So many people stepped down in the lead up to finally the president stepping down. So I think focusing on individuals was inevitable, even though it might not have been a strategy. In terms of systemic change, I did see many elements within Arugale calling for systemic change. And for example, there was one faction or one element within Arugale that called for systemic change in terms of abolishing the executive presidency. Many posters not only called for the resignation of the individual, it also called for the abolition of the office itself, which was tied to the crisis, right? I mean, one of the reasons for the crisis is because, as I said before, there was so much concentration in one person in terms of power. So I think that kind of systemic change was also there. I think systemic change in terms of calling for anti-corruption measures to be brought in was certainly there. I think there was some valuable and meaningful discussion on intercommunal relations, particularly conversations about the ethnic conflict, conversations about violence against the Muslim community. I saw elements of those conversations also taking place during the Aral. So I think in terms of a strategy, you're right, there wasn't an overarching strategy as such that focused on systemic change. But I think if you look at the slogan and the various mini slogans that orbited that central slogan, there were certain calls for systemic change. Whether we got that is a different matter. I think if you measure success in terms of systemic change, no, we haven't been successful, and Aral wasn't successful. But if the measure of success was the accountability of individuals that held power, I think forcing a resignation is also a form of accountability. So there was some element of success. So it all depends on what benchmark we use to assess the success of Aral.
We're taking a small break, but stay tuned. We'll be back shortly to continue our discussion on whether democracy is a panacea.
What makes a truly awesome insurance company? Is it the skills to manage big numbers and big responsibilities? Well, that's definitely part of it. But there's more. It's the people. They're awesome. Super passionate about looking out for others and putting in their time for people's finances. It's not just the people. It's how we do things that's awesome. From being trendsetters of the industry to being connectors or inventors. It's about well-being and how we achieve it. Our teams hustle non-stop to meet the needs of the people. That's why we're on the rise. And it's not just about how we do things either. It's about how we improve things. Helping our clients thrive in a world that's full of awesome goals to achieve. Making the maximum out of the minimum. But wait, there's more to it. There's one last thing that truly makes an insurance company awesome. It's that we care about our people and our customers. All of this combined, it's been a pretty awesome year. And we're excited for tomorrow.
Display your brand message on digital screens at prime locations. The largest digital advertising network in Sri Lanka. Emerging Media.
Welcome back to the show. We are in conversation with Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, a Commissioner of Human Rights, Commission of Sri Lanka, and a partner at LexAG Legal Consultants. So accountability seems like an issue that is often overlooked. How can we ensure greater accountability from our elected officials, especially given the widespread perception of corruption and inefficiency?
I mean, that's a really important question. And I'm going to go back to the point about voter indifference in between elections. We need to try and shift this and change that. And here I would probably think of some form of electoral reform that allows citizens to recall candidates or recall their representatives in between elections if they fail, right? If they are accused of corruption, if they have failed to deliver promises. And a few countries around the world have this measure of recall. Recall means that someone is elected to a seat in parliament, and then within that 5 years, some allegation is made, and say he or she is suspended from the party, or many people come to realize that this person has actually broken the promises that that person made during the electoral campaign. Some countries allow for a part of the constituency within that, or rather the constituency that voted that MP in, part of that constituency to sign a petition to force a by-election, where that person has to then contest an election just for that seat again, right? And the best example of this is is the United Kingdom, which in 2015 passed a particular act that allowed voters within a constituency to actually attempt to recall an MP. And if I'm not mistaken, you have to have at least 10% of the voters of that constituency signing a petition to trigger a by-election. And this, in fact, happened in 2018, where they attempted to recall an MP. Unfortunately, the petition got only 9-point-something% of the constituents calling for a by-election. If it hit 10%, I think there would have had to be a by-election. So that option is there. The moment you bring that kind of option in, an MP or a provincial council representative or a local government elected representative will be much more on their toes in terms of delivering on their promises. And if you look at, say, India or many other Asian jurisdictions, at the local level, certain states will have recall options, right? Where people can recall, say, the mayor or someone who is an elected official at the local level because they have failed to deliver on their promises. I think that is an important bit of reform that Sri Lanka should consider, because that will transform the way electoral representatives will actually behave during elections, because there's total impunity. Once you're elected, then they do as they please, and then closer to the next election, they'll go back into campaign mode. And people have got used to this cycle. And there's absolutely no accountability, as you said quite rightly. I think the recall and by-election model is something that we should really consider. And calling for that is something that maybe reformists should consider.
In that case, what specific electoral reforms would you advocate for to enhance transparency, increase voter confidence, and ensure more representative governance?
So if I were to say my wish list is this, I would say right at the top of the wish list would be the abolition of the executive presidency and replacing it with a parliamentary democracy that, moves away from concentrating power in one individual to a more deliberative model where more than one individual is responsible, and those individuals can be removed if they fail, right? That would be number one. Number two is a move away from the centralization of power. So these electoral reforms that I'm recommending has to be seen as a package. It's not enough to just abolish the executive presidency, because you can have a parliamentary system that is as bad, right? So having a system that moves away from the centralization of power, even at the national level in parliament, to a more devolved system where power is devolved to provincial level and the local government level, would be very important, because then power is exercised at a level that is closer to the people. And then accountability can be more meaningful if that happens. Number three, as I mentioned before, having a system of recall and by-elections when elected representatives at the national, at the provincial, and at the local level fail us. This has been done in other jurisdictions, so it's a question of studying those jurisdictions. And many of our democratic sort of features are borrowed from the United Kingdom. So it's not an alien system for us to study and see whether we can introduce certain elements of that law that was introduced in 2015. So I think that third element is also key at all levels if we were to move towards a more accountable model.
How do you think Sri Lanka's model of democracy is perceived by the international community, particularly in light of recent political turmoil and economic challenges?
I think it's a mixed bag. There will be countries that view Sri Lanka's democracy as in crisis and failing, and there'll be criticism at various fora of Sri Lanka's, the functioning of Sri Lanka's democracy. And a lot of those criticisms will be valid criticisms. But on the other hand, you'll also have countries that believe in Sri Lanka's democracy. And that's very clear in the level of support that Sri Lanka receives at the international level. There are many countries that want to see Sri Lanka succeeding, not only because Sri Lanka is, after all, a democracy and Sri Lanka failing is a blow to democracy, but also because there are countries with long ties with Sri Lanka. And I would hesitate to say that there's one unified position that the international community takes on Sri Lanka. It all really depends on who we're talking about. And there will be countries that are extremely critical, and rightly so. And there'll be countries that are much more sort of constructive and taking the approach of trying to help Sri Lanka, which is also necessary. So it's a mixed bag. And I think it's important for Sri Lanka's foreign policy is one that is completely neutral, that, ensures that we don't gravitate towards one superpower at the expense of good relations with other powerful nations. So that's a policy of neutrality and non-alignment that is very, very important for Sri Lanka. And I would say that its foreign policy has to embody that. But we can't be intransigent when we are criticized, because a lot of the criticism, particularly on human rights, on corruption, on the lack of accountability, are valid criticisms. And those nations might have their own agendas, but often there will be victim communities, there'll be civil society activists, there'll be NGOs that very genuinely champion these issues. And some of those issues are valid and are important issues that need to be championed. And it's because sometimes the space for championing those issues at the domestic level has closed that people are forced to go to the international level. And that's an inevitable thing. And you will hear political actors, even from all sides of the on the spectrum, threatening to go to the international, fora when their views are ignored at the domestic level. Right? That's a natural tendency. So I think it's important not to be too suspicious of those who seek the support of the international community. But at the same time, I think it's a mixed bag, and it's not necessarily accurate to say the international community is against Sri Lanka.
Any closing thoughts you would like to share with our audience?
So just to wrap up, I think it's important for us to be critical about how democracy functions in Sri Lanka without necessarily claiming that democracy has failed and we need something else. I think this is the time for a renewed commitment to liberal democratic values, right? Democracy and human rights going hand in hand. And I think if we were to think of reform, a move away from the centralization of power, both in terms of the executive presidency and in terms of devolving power is very important. But in addition to that, really exploring some alternatives to our current system where elected representatives are held to account even between elections through systems like recall and by-elections. So I think we need to think about all of these models and options and look at strengthening democracy as opposed to rejecting it.
We've had a thought-provoking conversation with Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, a partner at LexAG Legal Consultants and a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Dr. Gehan, thank you for sharing your valuable insights during this critical time for all Sri Lankans. It's been a pleasure discussing these important issues with you.
Thank you very much for having me.
To all our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe and take care.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.